Hello everyone and welcome back to another Fate video. After receiving such a huge outpouring of comments on the last prediction video, I decided to take some recommendations and elaborate further on them. All of the historical figures that you all sent were fantastic, but I can only pick one for each class. So that's what I'm going to do. Much like last time, I want to pick only fresh historical figures, so no class changes and no existing characters like Charlemagne. I still want to stick with doing just the standard 7 classes as well, just to keep things simple. So without further ado, let's get started. So for Sabres, a lot of people wanted to see Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, or as he is more commonly known, El Cid. A national hero of Spain, El Cid was the model for all knights. Strong, pious, loyal, and just. He was born into a minor nobility and served Sancho II until his death. Upon Sancho's death, the new ruler, Alfonso IV, poorly treated the loyal knight until eventually forcing him into exile. During this time, he joined the Muslim forces of Zaragoza and defended them from the Aragons. So prominent was he that he was able to regain much of his reputation as an unbeatable knight amongst the Zaragoza forces, that he was dubbed a great strategist and given the moniker Al Cid, which he would eventually adopt into a Spanish-sized version, El Cid. His prominence and prowess as a warrior were so great that the man who had previously exiled him realized that they would benefit much more from having him on their side, so he annulled the exile and allowed him back into his service. El Cid accepted this, but more or less did his own thing most of the time. He conquered the kingdom city of Valencia and made it a place for both Christians and Muslims off of the Mediterranean, and ruled over it until he himself died. He is a knight who kept going on the path of righteousness and eventually conquered a kingdom for himself. Gameplay-wise, I could see him being a support. While he himself was a successful warrior, his charisma and military intellect would likely be the focus. So I could see a tactics-like skill that also increases overcharge and maybe buster damage, a party-wide evasion skill because of his exile, and a targetable buff to buster damage for one turn. For an NP, I think something like the Triumphant Returned that gives a slew of buffs to the party would work well for him. With the upcoming Lost Belt 7, we are likely to see some Spanish and South American servants appear, and I believe that this one is a prime candidate. For archers, I think I only saw this one recommended once, but I personally think that he would be a great addition to the roster, despite being relatively recently deceased. In fact, this man only died in 2002, so it is incredibly unlikely that we get him as a servant. However, he does shine in the spotlight as being one of the most prolific snipers out of the Winter War. Simo Haya was a Finnish sniper who served during the aforementioned Winter War. He found that he had a natural talent for marksmanship at a very young age, and at the age of 19, he was enlisted into the military by Finland's compulsory service. During his first active service, his skill with the rifle shocked and awed his superiors. One recorded instance was his ability to hit a target accurately from 150 meters away, 16 times in under a minute using a bolt-action rifle. This means that after every shot he had to clear, load, aim, fire, and hit the target in less than 4 seconds. This is a near superhuman-like ability. During his service in the Winter War, which took place from 1939 to 1940 against the Russians, his abilities came to complete fruition. He wore a completely white winter outfit to both keep him warm in the negative 20 to negative 40 degree temperatures, but also to have him blend in with the snow. His weapon was a standard issue Civil Guard rifle, which was used with iron sights. This is because he believed it to be more effective as well as safer and more reliable in the harsh winter. He even states that those few centimeters that it takes to raise your eye to look through the lens is enough to get your head blown off. According to his own personal memoirs, he killed over 500 Soviet soldiers, due in large part to the fact that the Soviets had no camouflage, so they stuck out in the frozen environment as walking targets. For this, he received the nickname the White Death. Now, whether this was propaganda from the Finnish side or an actual nickname given to him by the Soviets is up to debate, but it is certainly a catchy name. His service ended when he was shot in the face by an explosive bullet that destroyed his upper jaw, most of his lower jaw, and most of his left cheek. He looked so gnarly that he was thrown on a pile of corpses, and only when someone went looking for him did they find his leg twitching in a pile, still unconscious but alive. He would fully recover and have his face surgically reconstructed, living to the age of 96. He is one of the most successful snipers in history and deserves a spot on the FGO roster. His skills are fairly clean-cut. He would be like William Tell, but on smart boosters. He would have an Ignore Evade for 3 turns with a huge crit up, an Evade and a Guts tied to the same skill based on his own stealth and survival from the brink of death. His third skill would be a massive 3-turn repeating Star Bomb and a Stark Gather Rate on it. His NP would be called the White Death and would be a single target, single hit, chance to instant death, massive hit that ignores Invincible, and has a crit up overcharge. The Archer class is already overpowered as hell, so what's adding another to it? For Lancers, the most common one that I saw is one that I have mentioned in the past, Sun Wukong. Naturally, the last time he was mentioned, I said he would be a berserker, and that does still stand in my opinion. But having him as a Lancer makes sense as well, given that he has the big stick TM. Wukong is one of the most well-known Chinese figures in the world, and has appeared in pretty much every form of media to date. From League of Legends to references in even Dragon Ball, he is everywhere, and for good reason. He comes to us from the Journey to the West, featuring everyone's favorite monk, Sanzo. Wukong is the first of her companions and the one bringing the most firepower, but he joins her service after he was being punished by the Buddha. So, how did that happen? So Wukong was born from a stone that was nurtured by both the yin and the yang of heaven. When he was born, his eyes shot golden beams at the heavens that startled the Jade Emperor, but upon learning it was just a mere stone monkey, he disregarded him. He would befriend the other animals of his mountain and would be dubbed the Monkey King, once he found the source of their mountain spring. He lived happily for a while until an older friend of his died, making him begin to think about his own mortality. So, he sets out to find a way to cure death. He eventually is guided to the hut of an immortal who, after many months of persistence, teaches him the Taoist ways as well as the way of immortality. He is then instructed to never reveal where he learned this from, and the monkey obliges. He then goes on to slay a demon who is kidnapping and enslaving monkeys and forces his way into the palace of the Dragon King and requests a weapon. He receives a magical golden banded staff that stabilizes the seas, and he is the only one with the strength enough to wield it as an actual weapon. He then requests other items fit for a king to wear, and the other Dragon Kings gift him a great amount of treasures. He then rallies a group of other demon kings to his side until he is banished to hell for extorting the Dragon Kings. While in hell, though, he finds the Book of Life and Death and wipes his name and the names of his other monkeys from it, making him immortal twice over now. He is then reported to the Jade Emperor himself, who sends an army to attempt to erase him from existence. And that doesn't work. In an attempt to rein him in, the heavens give him the lowest position possible. But upon learning this, Wukong leaves. In an attempt to appease him again, Wukong is invited to the Jade Emperor's court for a feast of the peaches of immortality. He gets drunk and eats all the peaches, making him immortal thrice over. During this time, he also steals the pills of immortality from the sage Laozi, making him immortal for the 4th time. It is not until the actual Buddha gets involved that the Monkey King is humbled. The Buddha makes a wager with the arrogant king. He claims that if Wukong can escape his palm, he will appoint him the new Jade Emperor. The Monkey King agrees and leaps across the entire world only to find 5 great pillars far off into the distance. He marks where he was by graffitiing his name and pissing all over one of the pillars, before going back. To his shock and surprise, those pillars were the fingers of the Buddha, and he had failed his test. He is then placed under a mountain as punishment. There's a lot more to this as well, but I spent way too much time on this one character already. He would be a quick servant with a ton of guts and some huge firepower. Likely a lot of crit damage buffs, self buffs to damage, and lots of survivability. His NP would likely be all of his consumings of immortality and provide him with stackable guts with other damage up buffs tied to it. I could kind of see him like a quick Super Orion with a focus on survivability, plus, you know, Sanzo needs more pupils. For riders, Peter the Great was one I've seen and one that was suggested in the Discord. He was the great unifier of Russia and the one who brought them into the more modern era. It was through his conquerings that he brought in multiple westernized philosophies, taking inspiration from the Enlightenment that was occurring. In a sense, he brought the light of possibility to the Russian people. Peter became the Tsar of Russia at the age of 10, and as a result, his council ruled in his stead. He didn't seem to mind, and he idled his time away as a child. His mother would force him into a marriage at the age of 17 in hopes of getting him to take his future more seriously. This backfired, and he forced his wife into a bad habit by making her a nun. Sorry, dad joke. He did eventually remove his sister Sophia, who had failed to defend against the Crimeans twice. He took over her position and forced her into a life of a nun as well, stripping her of her name and royal status. Standing at a height of 2.03 meters, or 6'8" if you use American fund numbers, he was an intimidating man to behold. He set his sights for the International. He did full military revamps, and the Navy received a major rework. See, this is why he would qualify as a writer. The man loved naval warfare. He also opened the gates for the Russians to join the royal family marriages with other European monarchs. He enforced rules of absolute reform, making his court wear Western-style clothing and enforce a tax for long beards. Essentially, he was a weeb with a focus on Europe rather than Japan. His naval reforms would pay off, with his overthrowing of the Swedish control of the Baltic Sea, making Russian access to Europe much more simple. He is also the one who founded the former capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, named after himself, who was named after the saint. His history is long and complex, and I would love to do a full video on him in the future, but for now, here are his skills as recommended by Kriv in the Discord. For a skill, you can have Emperor Reformer, a party-wide 20% rainbow buff for 2 turns, apply an additional 30% rainbow buff to all allies with the Russian trait for 1 turn, a 30% defense up for 3 turns with a 6-turn cooldown. Traveling Incognito, apply a taunt to all allies except himself for 1 turn, increase buff removal resist by 100% of all allies except himself for 1 turn on a 5-turn cooldown. This is from his attempts at joining the Grand Embassy while disguised, but being a 6'8" giant, his disguise completely failed. It's like a Mr. Bean sketch almost, but it happened in real life. And then this unnamed skill, targetable 1-turn invincibility, 20% battery, 3k heal, debuff cleanse, 6 turns cooldown. His NP would be an arts NP called the Window to Europe. Effects is that it increases all allies critical damage by 30% for 3 turns, further increases critical damage for all allies with the Russian trait by 20%, with the overcharge effect of up to 40% additional crit damage. Grants party ignore defense class advantage for 3 turns, gain 10 stars per turn for 3 turns with overcharge. And so there you go. I honestly really like all of the Russian servants that we've gotten so far, so I would like to see more. For a caster, this is a shout out to all my Portuguese viewers. Please forgive me for I'm not going to be able to pronounce this correctly. He was essentially the Shakespeare of Portugal, Luís de Camoys. He is referred to as the greatest Portuguese poet, and Portuguese is sometimes referred to as the language of Camoys. Despite his somewhat obscure origins, we have some assumptions to make about his early life. We can assume that he was well educated in his early life given his abilities as a writer. He served as an academic tutor to a member of the nobility, possibly attempted to court the king's sister, which would have resulted in a prison sentence. Supposedly, he had its complicated relationship with another that did result in his own exile. During his time in exile, he would join up as a soldier and lose his right eye in a naval battle. Next, he wanted to travel to India with other soldiers after leaving his own exile, but got into a fight with the royal guard and injured himself on their sword and then was in prison for a while. He did receive a pardon before finally setting sail, leaving behind a letter that essentially said, "Fuck you, Portugal." This would not be the first time that he would be arrested either. In India, he would be arrested once again for accruing a large debt and would only be released once a friend of his took office and would be given the position of superintendent of the dead and missing. During this time, he began working on his first masterpiece, Os Luisadas. Ironically, he himself would go missing a few years after this, shipwrecked on an island, which would greatly define the themes of his stories. When he was finally rescued a few months later, he was arrested for stealing items from the dead that he was in charge of. After his release, he seemed to hunker down on his literature, and even returned to Portugal after nearly being swindled out of all of his money. On his return, he presented his work to the King of Portugal, Sebastian, who was still a teenager at the time, who was so impressed that he knighted him. Now, there is a whole lot more to talk about him than this, but much like all these characters, I only have so much time to dedicate to them. I could see him as a bronze servant like Shakespeare, so a party-wide quick up, maybe a targetable evade with a heal on it, and a star bomb with a targetable star gather would work. His NP would be Os Luisadas, and would provide defensive buffs to the allies and charm on the enemies. We need more authors because even though there is a lot, it's still not enough. For assassins, Xiaoyu was one that was submitted as completing the trifecta of the 3 kingdoms generals in the various classes. Zhui Liang being a caster, Sima Yi being a rider, and Xiaoyu being an assassin. That is the only reason for assigning the class, and frankly, I'm here for more support assassins. I'm still not very familiar with the Three Kingdoms era of China, so bear with me, because I know a lot of people are huge fans of it. Also, in completing the trifecta, I could see him as a pseudo-servant to Kenneth Malloy. He served under Sun She and Sun Quan, who did battle against Cao Cao. Actually, the more that I research, having him be associated with Kenneth is perfect, as both are described as handsome young men who would have died early on, and both serving as the foundation for something greater. Forgive me for not giving him as much time in the spotlight, but I don't have 18 hours to discuss the complexity of his character in real life. Just know that without his guidance, the Sun would not have been nearly as successful as they were, and when he did die at the age of 35, Sun Quan mourned him and paid in full for his entire funerary parade and funeral. Then, once he became emperor, Sun Quan declared that he would not be here if it were not for Xiaoyu. His kit would be simple, lots of MP charge and party-wide buffs, and much like his predecessors, I think he would have an arts NP modeled after the Battle of the Red Cliffs, in which he put a bunch of ships in the river down to an enemy's base and set them on fire, and it set all their ships on fire. It was a huge success, which would decrease the enemy's defense, stun them, burn them, and buff allies with attack and NP. Finally, for the Berserker, one that I have had my eye on and was mentioned in the comments not as a Berserker but as a rider and lancer is Don Quixote. He could fit into any of these 3 classes, but for my money, having the lunatic who rides a donkey and cosplays as a knight be a Berserker just makes sense. He's the main character for the novel of the same name, Don Quixote. He read so many books about knighthood and chivalry that he went mad. He refused to see that the world had changed from the chivalric knightly time that he had dreamed of, but in a delusional haze still roamed the countryside of Spain seeking adventure. here. You may recall that this was one of the characters that I put in my predictions for this year's silhouettes, and I still stand by it. He would have a Charisma Delusion skill that would buff attack and random card type, an evade with an NP charge attached to it, and finally a personal mana burst that lasts for 3 turns. His NP would be Don Quixote. It would be self buffs to him, regaining his senses to defend Spain. I love this man, and he needs to be in Caldea. But that is it. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know what you thought down in the comments. Leave some suggestions down there as well for what you would like to see next time that I do this. Like the videos, it really does help out the channel. Subscribe to catch these as they go up. Go ahead and join the Discord. Check out my Twitch for Neo Tuesdays and other fun stuff. I also have a Twitter. But for now, keep your chin up. Peace.